In this video, we're going to continue to look at our ecology as a science in this study of interactions amongst organisms and finish off with our community ecology. And now we can actually take a look at interactions between organisms that are living in a community, and you can see what are known as symbiotic relationships, which literally translates as living together. And these are long-term interactions between individuals of different species that can take the form of a variety of different kinds of relationships. And here, if we look at our mutualistic relationship, this is where two species actually benefit from that interaction. And you can see from this little figure here, we're looking at pollinators in plants. The plants are benefiting because their pollen is going to get transferred in here. Your bumblebee is going to benefit from this relationship because they're getting access to some extra food that they're going to need. And so this mutualistic relationship we can look as a plus-plus. It benefits both members of that relationship. We have seen some other kinds of or examples of mutualistic relationships this semester. When you look at something like a lichen, remember that's an algae or a photosynthetic bacteria is the producer, and they are going to be living together with a fungus that is out there that is the consumer and the decomposer there. So there's a relationship where they both benefit from this. We've also seen plants can have fungi growing in their roots with mycorrhizae. So there's a lot of different kinds of examples there. When we look at our commensal example here, this is where one species is going to benefit from that interaction, and the other one is kind of like, it's not benefiting and it's not harm. So I've got the plus and the zero here for this relationship. You can think about birds nesting in trees. The birds are benefiting from that. Or frogs that are living in trees. How about plants with these little seeds that stick to your socks? They're benefiting from that relationship, and you might be irritated by it, but you're really kind of neutral in terms of that interaction. You're carrying their seeds on your socks there and spreading their seed further, and this would work with an animal when those seeds stick to their fur and they carry that seed. The animal really isn't bothered by that relationship. But when we get to a parasitic relationship, now one organism in this relationship is going to benefit, and then the other one is actually going to be harmed as a result of that. And remember, when you look at this symbiotic relationship, we're not talking about a predator that is out there, because in that example with predators, the prey does not survive the relationship. But here, something like a mosquito or a tapeworm or a tick, they are definitely benefiting because they are sucking your blood, and you are going to get harmed as a result of that, but you are not immediately killed as you would when you're looking at a predator-prey interaction that is out there. All right, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and work our way all the way up to the top level there and look at ecosystems and the biosphere that is out there. And with an ecosystem, you're looking at communities of these living organisms and starting to see how they are interacting with their environment. And so those abiotic factors, those non-living factors, are going to come into play because they're going to influence all of these organisms that are living in that ecosystem. There is competition for these limited resources, not just within the population, but now you're looking at groups of populations making up communities and how those communities are interacting with each other. So that competition for food, water, light for photosynthetic organisms, space, and nutrients that are out there. All of these are going to come into play, and you also have to consider things like the physical environment. So the climate, the seasons, the sunlight, the amount of rainfall, and all of these different kinds of interactions that are going to come into play when you're looking at that ecosystem that is out there. And we've been looking a little bit at some of these interactions in the laboratory setting, and we've been looking a little bit at the trophic levels that are out there. And so now you're starting to take a look at this energy flow, but also nutrients that are flowing from your producers out there in the environment and working their way up through these consumers that are out there until you get to what's known as the apex consumer, the one that's at the top of that little food interaction that you've going on with your trophic levels. The thing that's really key to these kinds of energy interactions here is each trophic level is going to have less energy available to it, which means usually you're going to support a smaller mass of organisms. So here, when we look at the number of producers that are out there, there's going to be a huge amount of light energy coming into this ecosystem here that is based in Florida from this particular study. And you can see there's a massive energy content that is available in these producers out there. And then they're going to get eaten by these primary consumers. So take a look. Now you're up to this level right here. And there's less energy within all of these organisms. And then you go up to your secondary consumers. There's even less energy, and go all the way up to your apex here with your tertiary consumers. Much less energy available for those kinds of organisms in that particular ecosystem right there. We can also take a look at our food webs, where you're not only looking at those different trophic levels, but now you're seeing the interactions between these organisms across the trophic levels. So seeing what kinds of consumers are eating these different kinds of producers, but also what kinds of consumers are consuming other consumers, and what role the decomposers play in this whole food web interaction. And remember, eventually, those decomposers are the ones that are going to be eating the producers and the consumers, and basically recycling some of those elements back into the soil so that your producers can start all over again and start producing more of that organic material for that particular environment to grow and become a little bit more complex. Sort of as a side result from looking at these trophic levels and food webs, we've learned how chemicals can actually be concentrated with these different organisms that are out there. And this is what's known as biomagnification. And we can see this with a variety of different chemicals that are being released into our environment. We learned a little bit about DDT in the 70s and how this insecticide was actually being accumulated in different kinds of organisms, and when it worked its way up through that food web and hit the birds, it actually affected the stability of their shells, and it totally knocked out that population of birds because their shells couldn't survive, and that meant that the little baby chicks were dying off. In this example, what we see is polychlorinated biphenyls, which are used as refrigerant coolant liquids that are out there. And these PCBs are basically being concentrated. They start out being accumulated in your producers out there, and then they are going to get in higher levels or higher amounts for the amount of chemical per weight of this organism. And as you work your way up through these different levels into the consumers right here, you can see the total amount of those chemicals is going up higher and higher and higher. So these fish at the higher trophic levels are accumulating more and more of those chemicals. And then think about it. There's a bird that's going to come along and eat this fish with this massive amount of that chemical. What effect is that chemical going to have on that particular consumer? We can also see this when we look at things like metals that are out there. These metals are being accumulated in fish, and then we come along and eat them. How do you know that fish doesn't have a massive amount of mercury or arsenic that has been accumulating inside of these different organisms as it works its way along? And now you're eating what could potentially be toxic levels of these chemicals that could cause some serious damage to you, whether it's long-term damage or short-term. That's something that we're only now starting to find out. And this is having an impact on people out there during this time frame. I do have a friend who is a fisherman and goes out and collects a lot of fish, catches them in the ocean, and he had his blood checked and found he had elevated levels of mercury, so he's had to back off on the amount of fish that he's eating because of this idea of biomagnification there. All right, so when we look at this idea of the ecosystems that are out there, we can start to look at this interaction amongst all of these communities and start to look at different kinds of environments that are out there. And we get all the way up to looking at biomes, which is really this naturally occurring community where you're looking at both the plants and the animals and the other organisms that are occupying a major habitat that's out there. And if we look at our whole planet out there, we can basically split everything up into two major groups. You are either living in the water or you are living on land. And there's different ways of characterizing these locations or biomes on the planet. If you're living in the water, we're basically going to look at the physical environment there. And most of the planet here is covered by water. So about 75% of the Earth's surface is what's known as an aquatic biome. And the other part of the surface of the planet is going to be a terrestrial biome. And we can characterize that by looking at the vegetation types that are out there. When we look at these aquatic biomes, like I said, we're going to look at the physical environment that's out there. So think about what can have an effect on life that is in this watery environment out there. And think about these abiotic factors. Light is going to play a big role in determining what kinds of organisms can live here, because you need to have some producers that are going to be out there. And light is a ready source of energy. But then when we get down here into these lower zones, you're going to have to switch to some other form of energy, typically chemical. So light's going to play a big role in determining what kind of life can live and interact in these zones that are out there. Likewise, if you have the sunlight hitting the water is going to absorb some of the energy of that sunlight, and that'll affect the temperature. So you get these different layers in the water out there. When we look at the oceans and also things like rivers out there, the flow of the water is going to play a role in how these interactions are going on. And then we can also look at this final abiotic factor, which is the amount of dissolved solids or salts that are in that water can play a definite role in what kind of life can be supported there and there. And so if we look at our aquatic biomes that are out there, we can basically divide those up into two major groups. One of them is marine biomes, and there you're looking at water that is typically going to have a salt concentration of around 3%. And this includes things like the oceans and coral reefs, where you've got a whole bunch of marine invertebrates that are living in the photic zone. So they're kind of warm, shallow water that has a lot of available energy from the light out there. And this is one of the most diverse biomes on the planet. If you work your way closer to the land, you can run into intertidal zones, where you're going to see this interaction in a really, really shallow area that sometimes can actually lose the water as the tides are going in and out there. And if you think about it, these animals have to make some major adaptations, because those are very distinctly different kinds of environments out there. The other kind of thing we can look at is sort of this transition area going on where rivers are running into the ocean. And here you really have to adapt to this environment, because if you think about it, those are two completely different environments. You've got your fresh water over here, you've got your salt water over here, and you've got your tides going in and out. And so those animals and other plants that are living in this estuary right here have to be adapted to all of these different kinds of conditions out there. And think about, this is going to change the water temperature, the clarity. The fish are going to be competing as they are going back and forth. Really a lot of interactions going on when you look at this estuary region. If we look at our other major aquatic biome, there's your freshwater biome, where you're looking at salt concentration that's typically less than 1%. So things like lakes and streams and rivers. And this has, they estimate around 6% of all described species that are out there. And with this, you can really think about, we have a good example. Look at the Merced River. When it starts out up in Yosemite, it's really clear, fast-moving water, and it works its way down to the valley, and it's picking up more and more solids and getting more and more sort of salty as it works its way down there. So that's changing those characteristics of the water that you're looking at there. The last sort of thing that we can take a look at here is what's known as wetlands. And here you're looking at things like marshes and swamps. And this is really that transition zone when you're going from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. The soil is saturated with water, and you're going to have a lot of aquatic plants, but you run into some problems with the environment